Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I'm Ron Granieri from FPRI, and all of us at FPRI thank you for joining us live today on Zoom and recorded on the FPRI YouTube page. Paul Nitze was one of the architects of American foreign and security policy in the second half of the 20th century. The primary author of NSC 68, a foundational document in American Cold War strategy, Nitze enjoyed a 5-decade career in Washington's highest circles, becoming a key figure in the arms control agreements of the 1980s. Nitze is not exactly a household name for most Americans. He did, however, place his name on one of the most influential public policy schools, think tanks in Washington, D.C., the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, which is enough of a monument, I suppose, to anybody interested in international affairs. But Nitze was a striking example of a particular type of Washington power player, a policy intellectual who was also deeply engaged in both the details of power and in public debates, but who never did quite reach the level of political celebrity reserved for such contemporaries as George Kennan or Henry Kissinger. In his new book, America's Cold Warrior, James Graham Wilson offers more than just a biography of an important policy intellectual. Wilson traces the debates that Nitze shaped, his influence in them, and connects Nitze's career and concerns about strategic vulnerability to the post-9/11 era and to the challenges of the 2020s, where the United States finds itself locked in geopolitical competition with the People's Republic of China, as well as with Russia. So who was Paul Nitze? What were his contributions to American security policy, and what influence do his ideas and accomplishments still have today? These questions, and yours, will guide us in our conversation with James Graham Wilson. James Graham Wilson is a historian at the U.S. Department of State, where he is currently responsible for editing volumes in the Foreign Relations of the United States series on arms control and national security during the Reagan administration. In addition to America's Cold Warrior, he is also the author of the widely praised book, The Triumph of Improvisation, Gorbachev's Adaptability, Reagan's Engagement, and the End of the Cold War. And we are delighted to have him with us today. Good afternoon, James.
Thank you so much, Ron. Thank you to FPRI for having me, and to Christine for setting this up.
Absolutely. It's great to have you here for this conversation. And all of you out there, please remember to use the Q&A feature to post questions, which we will fold into our chat. So, James, I want to start with the most basic question. So you wrote about Reagan, Gorbachev, and Schultz. What made you decide that you wanted to write about Paul Nitze?
Well, Ron, first of all, I forgot to say I'm obliged or compelled to say that the views are my own and not those of the U.S. State Department. To the question of the origins, so I think it really comes down to a moment in the year 2014. I was at a presentation, a panel at the Wilson Center in the DC, where Frank Castigliola, a wonderful historian, was speaking about his project on editing the diaries of George Kennan. And he then went on to write a book about George Kennan. And during his presentation, about what Kennan thought and what Kennan was saying about topics later on in the Cold War, about Vietnam and then about the INF deployment in the 1980s, I kept thinking to myself, he wasn't really in the room. I don't think people actually were paying attention. Actual policymakers were not paying attention. He may have been receiving coverage because he was being critical of whatever administration was in power, but I don't actually think he was shaping decisions made by people in positions of power. And at that moment, I had finished the book about the end of the Cold War, and I was working on a project, a volume in the Foreign Relations of the U.S. series. I was working closely with you, Ron, I think, across the river. We had some wonderful experiences. But I was working on a volume covering arms control in the 1980s. And most significantly, the negotiations that led to the first Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. And I kept thinking to myself, there is somebody who's actually in the room and leading US negotiations during that period. And by the way, he also was in the room for Vietnam and other parts of the Cold War. And even when he was out of government, that person was really commanding White House attention, and that person was Paul Nitze. And I kept thinking to myself, George Kennan gets so much attention, but after the beginning of 1950, when he leaves government, I really don't think he has much impact at all on US foreign policy making. And, to continue the origin story a little bit, just for a minute, Frank Castigliola, again, just a wonderful, wonderful person. I went out to dinner with him and talked it through, and he was very encouraging. He said, "Well, you should pursue this, and you should make this a project and go with it." It took me some time. I was daunted, but one of the things that was helpful is over the years there were some really good models in terms of other scholarship that was helpful to me. David Milne's World Making was one. A little later on, Tom Schwartz's biography of Henry Kissinger was a really, I think, really important sort of guide to me in terms of how to balance, what is sometimes just a huge amount of material and, focus on a specific set of themes. So, I didn't do it as urgently as I should have, but I will say that, once we got to, I think, early March of 2020, there was something going on in the world. We were kind of shut in. My wife and I were expecting our first child, and I just thought, I've got to do this. And I do think that at the end of the day, there are important components of his life that speaks to the challenges of our time.
Well, and I do agree, and you do a very nice job of it in the book. I like the way you describe this problem, right? The paradox of George Kennan has always been that historians love to talk about him because he became a historian and published books, and so therefore people sort of have this image of him as this philosopher king. But Kennan was, not only was he not in government service, but Kennan also ended up writing and thinking an awful lot of things that turned out to be very embarrassing for his biographers. His attitudes towards American democracy, for example, are not most biographers end up having to try to explain them away. Paul Nitze has the advantage of living almost as long as George Kennan, but not having written any embarrassing semi-fascist reflections on American democracy, which is a plus for Paul Nitze. But this idea that Nitze does stay involved in government across administrations. I mean, Nitze is an interesting character, and I wanted you to reflect on this, right? That he works for both Democratic and Republican administrations. There seems to be a pretty clear ceiling above which he doesn't go. But he also, to use the terms we like to use over in the military, and also I'll repeat your disclaimer, right? Whatever I say is not the opinion of the Department of Defense. But he had a ceiling. He also had a pretty high floor, right? So people, he never got, or it rarely was to define himself completely excluded, even if there was limits how far we could go. How do we explain Nitze's ability to stay involved in policymaking for those almost 50 years?
Well, thanks, Ron. There's a couple of questions in there, and let me just kind of try to go through them individually, if I can. In terms of Nitze and democracy, Nitze was very committed to American democratic institutions, and it's something where I think he matured. When he came into government in 1940-41, working for James Forrestal. Not that he had been on the fence beforehand, but he sort of was more committed to kind of democratic principles being in Washington. He considered himself, I would say, above politics. Just to give a brief kind of overview, he was from a family. Father was a Romance language professor at University of Chicago. The family identified themselves as big D Democrats. He marries a woman who is an heir to a fortune related to Standard Oil, and her mother is a Republican who loses in the 1932 election. Nitze does not particularly like Franklin Roosevelt. And more importantly, I think that, and he doesn't really write about this in his memoir, but in some of the material at the Library of Congress, you get a sense that he is very kind of put off by the, again, big D Democratic machine that he saw in New York City. So he kind of thinks partisan politics is beneath him. He sort of a little bit ostentatiously registers as a Republican in 1937 in response to FDR's court packing scheme. But then, as I said earlier, he follows James Forrestal, who was a Democrat, to Washington, and he really goes to work. And I think during this period of 1940 to 44, he is extremely frustrated by the role of partisanship in crafting the war effort, which Nitze understandably sees as, we need to win the war. When he's overseeing 100 or so geologists trying to get critical minerals for the war effort, he gets a lot of flack about how all the geologists he hires are registered Republicans. He's very frustrated by this. And so this kind of, I would say that that's the germ for him. He later switches a couple times his party. He switches back to being a Democrat, I think in 1952, and then he wants to stay on under Eisenhower. But to your second question, it is true, I think, that after the Truman administration, he is basically identified with the Democratic Party. He sticks with Dean Acheson when Eisenhower is in office, and expects high office in a JFK administration. And then, leading up to 1976 with Jimmy Carter, I'm pretty sure that he expected that he would be Secretary of Defense under Jimmy Carter, up until they had a meeting in the summer of 1976 in Georgia that went quite terribly. Paul Nitze was quite, it was oil and vinegar really between Carter and Nitze. But to your third question is sort of how do you account for his longevity? And just to say it again, he from 1940 to 1989, he's really either in government or when he's not in a particular administration, such as with Eisenhower and Jimmy Carter, he has his security clearances held, I think in the 50s by the CIA. And then they were, through something called the System Planning Corporation under Jimmy Carter. And he's, involved in a number of bespoke consultancy projects, even when he's being critical of the president outside of that on a public realm. And then, after 1989, he's kind of less involved. But so how does he do it? I mean, I think that reasons I elaborate in the book is probably fundamentally he obtains very early on a real knowledge and confidence in the role that nuclear weapons, atomic and then nuclear weapons, were going to play in the post-World War II order. And he is kind of comfortable arguing with anyone. He goes in to meetings in 1943, 44 with military generals, the top caliber, and he has no background in this, but he had kind of gotten comfortable, I think, from his time on Wall Street in the 30s, really, arguing with, business titans and being willing to accept their rage. He just could hold his own. But he could back it up in terms of knowing what it was like to think about using atomic weapons, as was the case in some of the scenarios he encountered when he was the head of policy planning during the Korean War. And so then, there was a limited pool of people who could do that. He didn't get along very well with John Foster Dulles, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of State. And yet you see Dulles repeatedly bringing him back throughout the 1950s to ask his advice or to get him to serve as a sounding board, because he had all the security clearances, he had the experience, and there's a really limited number of people who could be helpful at that.
Right. You mentioned that even in the 1970s, when he's critical of the Carter administration, he's critical of the SALT II treaty. I believe it's Harold Brown, former associate who becomes Secretary of Defense, who says, Paul, you're basically one of the only people who disagrees with us about SALT II, who's read the treaty and understands its provisions. which I guess you use the phrase a couple of times. You talk about the theology of nuclear weapons, and that, so in a sense, right, Nitze is a member of the priesthood, right? He understands its secrets and has devoted his time to understanding those secrets, and so he's, yeah, so as a result, right, he has to be included in these conversations, or he could, because he's not merely attacking, say, particular treaties for partisan reasons, right? Instead, he wants to discuss specifics. I have a question just came up
Yeah.
From somebody that I know that we both know very well, Thomas Schwartz, who notes
Oh,
that
didn't realize he was here.
exactly right. He was here. He was here the whole time. That's right. But that he mentions that Professor Ernest May at Harvard had been one of the authors of the study on the strategic arms competition that was commissioned in the late 70s, published in the early 80s. And you mention it in the book as well. Did Nitze have anything to do with that study? And was he at all influenced by its arguments about the nature of the strategic arms competition?
I don't believe he was involved, and if he was involved, it was tangential. I think the point I try to make in the book is that by the time the study was completed and kind of received some attention within the administration, then the Reagan administration, Nitze was somebody who kind of knew as much as anything in it. Knew as much, okay, but let me just be clear here that I'm not saying he was right about everything, that he kind of had as much of a background and a grasp of the theology, as you say, to the extent that any single person, and there's a theme I try to make in the book, that you had people like Tom Schelling kind of writing these statements of what JFK should do during the Berlin crisis and what should come following an initial nuclear attack. And the bottom line, and we have to really be humble here, I think, in looking at the Cold War, is that no nuclear state has ever attacked another nuclear state. And from Nitze's point of view, his kind of animating concept after the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis is really what sticks out. And while he had a petty side and could go after people based on pettiness, and I think it really was not, that wasn't the fundamental issue, and it wasn't the fundamental issue of politics. It was that he saw the peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis as a result of US nuclear and conventional superiority. Both things he believed were eroding, but other people, and most notably Robert McNamara, saw it as both sides have gone to the brink and they will decide never to approach that again. And Nitze vehemently objected to that. And there's a quote I have in the book that I think was well known at the time, where a Soviet diplomat says to, I think it was John McCloy or Robert Lovett, says, "You'll never do this to us again. This is never going to happen."
Yeah.
That the Soviets are not going to, tolerate anything below parity or superiority in some instances. And from Nitze's point of view, you could do all the things you want about, all the studies you wanted, and it fundamentally came down to the fact that after the Soviets unveiled this missile that was far bigger than they needed under the concept of mutual assured destruction, the SS-9 and then the SS-18, that Nitze believed that the scenario you had always to consider was that Soviet leaders would be able to take out land-based US nuclear forces, the Minuteman IIIs. And then they would be able to say to the American president, okay, what are you going to do? Are you really going to retaliate by attacking our cities? Because then we'll attack your cities. And, you have the choice, surrender or we'll, kill 100 million Americans. And Paul Nitze really believed that, I try to make the case, and it's hard to kind of find a lot of firm evidence for this, but I kind of intuit, I believe that Nitze, having been around US presidents and his kind of concept of US strategic culture or what the American people would tolerate, Nitze believed that no American president would press the button, would sacrifice 100 million Americans to retaliate. But then you kind of go down what he liked to call his logic chains. Okay, so what does that mean? Because it's 1977, whatever. It's not that nuclear war is going to happen out of the blue. It's that you could have a deterioration that could lead to another situation like 1962, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in that scenario, the Soviet leaders, confident that ultimately an American president would back down, would be more inclined to take considerable risk, and therefore we, the United States and US presidents, would deter ourselves and not have freedom of action. And that really to me encapsulates the Nitze scenario. And Harold Brown,
you see,
and this they had big fights about it. I mean, these were real real battles that they would have arguing this kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Well, and this is a point that you make in the book, and it's related to what you were just saying, is that Nitze was not a theorist of nuclear war fighting, right? He was as you say, he didn't have a lot of truck for theorists like Schelling, who imagined that you could do a demonstration attack at some lower level with nuclear weapons. Instead, Nitze was a strong believer in deterrence, right? And that the goal was to have a powerful enough nuclear deterrent that the enemy wouldn't try something. And I find that fascinating that he knows so much about nuclear weapons, precisely because he believes it's very difficult to imagine nuclear weapons being used. And the point of having enough power is so that you're not really confronted with the possibility of using the weapons, right? It's one of these great nuclear weapons paradoxes, right?
Right.
And related to that as well is his, that's a position that is difficult to communicate to the broader public. And he runs into this problem sort of even with Ronald Reagan, where he ends up having real influence over Reagan's approach to nuclear arms reduction. But in the beginning, he finds himself fighting against a Reagan administration that was more hostile to nuclear weapons than he was. Because while he's looking at strength and then deterrence and then nuclear arms reduction, when Reagan is talking about, say, the zero option for intermediate range missiles, Nitze, who is his negotiator in Europe, is skeptical about that. And actually gets himself in a little bit of trouble, even though he doesn't lose his job. He gets himself in a little bit of trouble by speculating with the Soviets about some kind of an agreement less than, so that's short of the zero option in the so-called walk in the woods in 1982, which the question I'm bending around to on this is what I think makes Nitze fascinating is that he is sometimes the most hawkish voice in Democratic circles. And other times he is in some ways the most dovish voice in Republican circles. Is that intentional on his part, do you think, that he always sort of wanted to push back against the mainstream?
Well, he very much disliked the model that Strobe Talbot used to describe him, which was a kind of variant of that it was basically he opposed arms control when he was out of administration, and when he was inside of an administration, he embraced it. And I also I have a hard time coming around to Hawk versus Dove. Nicholas Thompson, by the way, has been wonderfully supportive to me in this project. I've kind of expressed that to him, and it's hard to say Hawk versus Dove. I think in Nitze's case, I do think that there's a consistency in what he believed. He sometimes would modulate in his priorities, but I don't think that it's really the absolute best way to say like he was a liberal in a conservative administration, vice versa. I think that if I could just dwell a bit on the example you mentioned in the summer of 1982, because it's so important, the so-called walk in the woods. I think many of you in the audience know that he takes the Soviet negotiator Kvitsinski into the woods, and they kind of go through a proposal. He had written up some ideas for how you could have a smaller deployment of INF missiles, Pershing IIs and cruise missiles, and how the Soviets would have, a more limited deployment of the SS-20s. Now, why did he do it? Well, I think Paul Nitze had a very clear memory of the US giving away the Jupiters in Turkey during the Cuban Missile Crisis, something that was absolutely superfluous. You could write a whole book about the issue of the Jupiters in Turkey, but the bottom line is, by the time we said we would give them up, Khrushchev had already decided to back down. But from Nitze's perspective, that the minute you start caving in terms of any part of the alliance, you're going down a bad road. And on the other side of the equation, that he could read the street or read about what was happening in the domestic politics of U.S. NATO allies, which was that there was great fear and great sense that it was actually NATO was the aggressor when NATO had in fact not deployed the missiles. It was the Soviets who had deployed them, but nonetheless you had to take that into consideration. And so from Nitze's point of view, there needed to be some kind of interim thing that was less than what Reagan put forward. And I think it's admirable and noble that he stretched the bounds of his authority. And what's interesting and important, I would say, is that it gets back to DC and it's seriously considered. I mean, the people around Reagan were very frustrated with him, understandably, because he had, exceeded his authority. But he's not fired. When word breaks in January of 1983, the person who takes the hit is Eugene Rostow, who had been the head of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. He had advocated for Nitze for the job, but he had his own kind of turf battles with some others in the Reagan administration. And Nitze remains, and more importantly, I argue in the book that Reagan himself actually starts considering what Nitze said, and he himself modulates in 1983 toward entertaining an interim agreement. The problem was the Soviets rejected it. I mean, at the end of the day, we focus on the kind of sometimes the machinations within Washington, but you can have all this, and then the Soviets, the Russians step in, and they reject to be a party to any of it. I'm happy to talk either now or later about why I think it's important in terms of Nitze's relationship to Reagan and how it might be important today.
Yeah, well, we'll come back to that but I do think this is a very interesting point, right? Is when we talk about arms control, right? And I found it interesting in the course of your book that there is this sort of dialogue between Nitze and Strobe Talbot. The Talbot, when he's at Time magazine in the 1980s, is critical of Nitze, is critical of the Reagan administration, it gets back to the point that you just made, is that we talk a lot about the machinations and the politics of discussions about arms control among American negotiators, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there wasn't going to be a deal if the Soviets weren't willing to make a deal. And Talbot was pretty hard on on the Reagan administration more broadly, right? He accused the Reagan administration perhaps of being more intransigent than perhaps that it was, because there was no agreement. Whereas the Reagan administration's response is there can't be an agreement if the Soviets don't want to make one. And so when Nitze and Reagan see the opportunity, you recently participated in a forum review of Will Inboden's book about Reagan, The Peacemaker, on H. Diplo, which if anybody wants to read that review. And in that book, where Inboden makes that point about Reagan, that, whatever you might think about Reagan's influence on allowing Gorbachev to come to power, it matters a whole lot that he recognizes what can happen with Gorbachev. And Nitze was skeptical about Gorbachev, but he recognized the possibility for real progress in arms control in the second Reagan administration. And can you describe this plan that was the Monday program that he works out with Ronald Reagan and its impact on the arms control in the latter part of the 1980s.
Yeah, so I try to say a little bit provocatively in the latter chapters of the book that I think that Paul Nitze's greatest influence was during that second Reagan administration. And I think part of and this strategic concept, by the way, precedes the ascent of Gorbachev in March of 1985. Mm-hmm. But what he tried to do at the end of 1984 and was assisted by a guy named Jim Timby, who might be known to some of you, was to come up with a kind of three-part, kind of parsimonious series of paragraphs that would reconcile some of the internal U.S. divisions and reach out to the Soviets. And it was fundamentally meant to say, well, we've had this balance of terror all these past couple decades, and we want to move away from strategic offenses to a reliance on strategic defenses. And here's a way we might think about doing it over 3 phases of 5 years. And that, I think, really appealed to President Reagan's conviction that he wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons if it were possible. And what I try to say in the book is that over the series of a couple of weeks, that becomes the U.S. position. I mean, an idea that Nitze had, it becomes a policy, and much of it precedes Gorbachev. Although if you look, but then it takes Gorbachev really to, two to tango. Nitze is a little bit, it's a little hard to say about him and Gorbachev, because he recognizes that Gorbachev is different, but his I think reaction to it is that this is actually going to be more dangerous, in the sense that when I said earlier that he's above politics, he also doesn't have to run for office, right? And this is, he's very much influenced by something that a key theme that Tom Schwartz makes in his book about Nixon and Kissinger in the 1972 election, which was basically Nixon said, I want to get an arms control agreement. I don't care what it looks like. Just get me something by the time I run again. And Nitze was furious about the so-called START 1 Accord. He thought it was a terrible deal that was rushed for purely political reasons. And what he worried about was that if you had deals that weren't good deals, then the American people would kind of move on. They would say, okay, well, we solved this issue of nuclear weapons. And what that meant for Nitze was that there would no longer be support in Congress for building the type of strategic systems that he thought was necessary to provide incentive to get the Soviets to bargain. I mean, part of the reasons why the Nixon people liked him was that he had kind of come on board to rally for Safeguard, kind of anti-ballistic missile program in 1969 that was being built, for the intent purpose of giving it away, of negotiating it away. So I think he really had that on his mind during the Gorbachev period, but by God, he was trying as hard as he could in 1987 and 88 to get an agreement. And I do think, I say in the book, and I hold to it, that the behind the scenes in December of 1987, when you have Gorbachev and Reagan signing the INF treaty, up the road, you have really the hammering out of a basic numerical agreement and a commitment to some form of verification that ultimately becomes the START 1 agreement. And that's, it's Nitze leading this expert group, this exchange with a Soviet general, or Soviet Marshal Akrameyev. So I think he deserves really a lot of credit for that period.
Yeah, well, and this the fact that Nitze is politically hard to categorize, right? That he favors Reagan's defense buildup, but he is not a fan of supply side economics, right? He actually argues, and this goes back, and this allows us to go back maybe to the beginning of the story, right? That when Nitze's writing NSC 68 and he's speculating on the need for extended, or let's say enhanced American military exertions in order to provide the security necessary to respond to the Soviet threat. Nitze is a firm believer that, yeah, you got to raise taxes to pay for these things,
Yeah.
right? He's not somebody who says, we can do this because we'll save money someplace else. He says, no, it costs money. And if it matters, we should pay for it. And this, I think, to circle back to Nitze's role in NSC 68, right, is do you see a general consistency in Nitze's approach to American security and what American defense policy should be?
I do. I mean, there's a couple things worth I think just remembering. In terms of the crafting of NSC 68, the mandate was, what does it mean? So Truman, accepts going forward on the hydrogen bomb in January 1950, right. Research at least. And then the mandate is, what does it mean? What does a world of hydrogen, where the hydrogen bomb exists, what does it look like? And so Nitze embarks on this project, and meanwhile, the Secretary of Defense, Lewis Johnson, had committed to Truman to keep the defense budget at like $13 billion. And through some means of conniving, Paul Nitze kind of sets up a situation where he hosts Johnson and Dean Acheson and others on the 7th floor of the State Department, and they kind of ambush the Secretary of Defense by saying, we're going to recommend to the president that we go for tripling of the defense budget. And it's something, as I think many people know, that Truman then was very reluctant to do. It really took the outbreak of the Korean War in June of 1950 for him to come around. But one of the points I make in the book is that, Nitze himself, by the end of 1952, was still very frustrated with Truman, and he didn't think that the United States, after rapidly demobilizing after 1945, he didn't think that the United States had done what it needed to do to restore its strength and rebuild that of US allies. And what happened then, and here we kind of have to keep in mind that up until recently, whatever recently is, that stewardship, it was good stewardship to balance the budget, right? I mean, right. Truman was being told it doesn't really matter if you can pursue your universal health insurance, whatever you want, and there's a way to get through it for a few years with deficits. But the will of the country and the kind of sense of good stewardship, as demonstrated by Eisenhower, was that you need to balance the budget. And from Nitze's perspective, the kind of obsession with balancing the budget made Eisenhower more willing to focus on massive retaliation, and which Nitze really just thought was the wrong approach. I mean, he wanted to restore conventional capabilities, and certainly was thought nuclear security was important, but the way Eisenhower was doing it and the way Dulles was pronouncing it really irked Nitze. But just let me close, right, because I'm meandering a bit. But I mean, like 40 years later, sure. 30 years later, I do think it's very. I mean, it's kind of interesting, at least, but I do think important that, Nitze is on record in the early 80s on, goes on firing line, and he's saying Reaganomics is a terrible idea, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, to the credit of the Reagan administration, they didn't care. I mean, they're just sort of like, we're going to pick the person who's best qualified, best suited to negotiate this treaty, and we don't care what he thinks about taxes. So it's, right. Not so much ideological purity that we think about more recently.
That this is an excellent point, right? Is one doesn't want to romanticize the past, but it is worth noting that it takes a degree of broad-mindedness on the part of both Nitze and the administrations that he works with. Is here we're going to take this guy who disagrees with us on some things, but he has valuable knowledge and valuable skills that can be put to use for the good of the country. And so we're not going to freeze him out just because he doesn't agree with us 100% on everything.
Yeah.
I think is, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
But can I just say on this point quickly that, the relationship between Reagan and Nitze was very cordial and mutually respectful. And it really, I think, has a lot to do with what was the declassification of NSC 68 in 1975, that
Hmm.
Reagan, as some audience members may know, that after he comes very close to winning this 1976 Republican primary, he goes back to California and he does this series of radio broadcasts, which really sustained him in the public conversation.
Hmm.
And he did a number of radio broadcasts devoted to NSC 68, which I think Eugene Rostow had sent to him. And so from Reagan's perspective, he identified very much with Truman, President Truman, and kind of saw himself as a connection. Sorry, he saw Nitze as a connection to the early Cold War
Hmm.
periods, and made the case that the Democratic Party had kind of lost its sense of first principles. But then here was somebody, Paul Nitze, who was saying many of the same things that Reagan was saying about the state of affairs, about détente. And while Nitze didn't, I think, officially endorse Reagan, Reagan really appreciated him as somebody who believed fundamentally the same things he did about the Cold War.
Right. Well, and this is connected, of course, to Nitze's work with the Committee on the Present Danger, which during that period when he was not in the Carter administration was giving it advice, but was also outside of it. That he was among these critics of détente, but at the same time, as you just point out, he's not as overtly partisan political as perhaps other members of the Committee on the Present Danger would be. And many members of the CPD ended up becoming known as the neocons in the 1980s. And I don't think it's fair to call Paul Nitze a neocon in the sense that there's a certain consistency in his attitudes, right? He didn't change fundamentally. But that gets to the idea about, where does this all come from? And, Fritz Heinzen actually asked the question about Nitze's role in the U.S. strategic bombing survey. And I'm thinking just more broadly about, what did Nitze do in U.S. government before the Cold War that shaped his attitudes towards American security once the Cold War started?
Well, I think that his time in World War II, the first thing that comes to mind was he was very unimpressed by U.S. government institutions in wartime, and particularly the State Department. He thought that it was
Yes.
And the State Department. I've yet to encounter something that really a book that portrays it well during World War II. But he thought that the kind of institutions of governance were fundamentally underserved. That we're not serving the American people, and it's one of the reasons he stayed. He had just been kind of told off by some kind of hack. I'm blanking on the name. Somebody who had ambitions to, I think, a former governor, to succeed Harry Truman. He had just been kind of gotten into some kind of mucky-muck with some fracas when he was asked to come on to the strategic bombing survey. And I think that is fundamentally important in terms of propelling his career and shaping his thoughts. So as I think many honest members may know, that there's two parts of the strategic bombing survey. The first is, you could call it like a quick applied history project where the U.S. and its allies are concerned about the kind of whether are we actually inflicting harm on the German warm economy that makes it worthwhile the tremendous losses that we're absorbing, and if not, how do we change it? So Nitze is involved in looking at the German ball bearings industry and trying to figure out, what is the most effective way that we can harm the German economy. More important, I would say, than that first episode is the second one, which takes place after Japan surrenders in 1945. And there was the mandate was still figure out what had worked leading up to this. Nitze was very sure that he knew the answer because he had a year in, I think, 1944, he had laid out a plan that he had drafted on the beach. He had laid out a plan to the U.S. Sort of high command that he was quite sure if we had adjusted the bombing and strategic bombing in the way that he proposed, that we wouldn't have to use the atomic bomb. Nitze had no knowledge of the atomic bomb. He found out about it when everybody else did. Obviously, quite a day to be talking about it. But he had this conviction, and when he was kind of asked by Truman, and he stays on, he's the vice chair of the Japan part of the Strategic Bombing Survey, that he's asked by Truman to look into this, and then Truman says almost as an aside, "Oh, and if you can figure out why they attacked us in the first place, that would be interesting to the survey too." So Nitze does this, and I make the case in the book when a lot of people go back to their pre-wartime positions in late 1945. He stays in Japan. He's offered to be the deputy to General MacArthur. He, I think, very wisely turns that down because he has heard he's kind of a difficult guy to work for. But he stays on with the project, and he writes most of the preface to the Strategic Bombing Survey for Japan in early 1946. And his fundamental conclusion, which I think remains consistent for the rest of his career, is that the reason why Imperial Japan attacked the United States is because we did not present a sense of a strategic deterrent. They knew that they could get away with it, or they believed they could get away with it. And the fundamental problem was that we let our guard down, and never again can we let this happen. Now, in the spring of 1946, as he's writing this, he's also paying a lot of attention to what's happening in the Soviet Union, the fact that they haven't demobilized. He's looking at Stalin's so-called election speech. And when he tries to make this case that we're actually seeing a number of the same things now happening with respect to the Soviet Union as Japan in the late 1930s, he's smacked down by Dean Acheson. He says, you're seeing things. And then he's very frustrated when a few weeks later, George Kennan writes his long telegram, which, Kennan's a much better writer, and James Forrestal, it's his great mentor, is telling everybody you need to read it. So he's, quite annoyed by this because he thought that he got it right first. I think it's a really important question, and I think the Strategic Bombing Survey really encapsulates, his view of the world, coming after being, in DC and seeing, the state of U.S. institutions.
I do say I love that story about Nitze feeling like he got scooped by Kennan. I think every academic, every policy analyst, right, has that feeling when they open up the latest issue of Orbis or Foreign Affairs and they see that somebody's like, oh man, he wrote that article that I was thinking about writing. The difference is that Paul Nitze could spend 40 years essentially still trying to get out in front of policy questions. We've got about 10 minutes to go. And I'm relating this very question about, the role of sort of creative intellectuals in making policy. Is you talk about how Nitze believed very strongly that the goal was to be a man of action, right? To be somebody who's making policy, not just talking about it. And that's why he had ambivalent feelings about academics. Let's say well-justified ambivalence towards academics, as anybody could say. But at the same time, he helps to create the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, which now bears his name. What did Nitze think SAIS was going to do? What mission did he have in mind for it? Even as he never did, unlike somebody like, say, Walt Rostow, who ends up retiring to the LBJ school after he leaves government in 1966. Nitze never retires to SAIS in the way that other people do. But what did he imagine SAIS to be and SAIS to do when he founded it or helped found it?
He co-founds SAIS with Christian Herter. They had been, I think, roommates at one part of the wartime years, one point. And I should know this better, but I think we're connected by kind of their wives were cousins. There was some kind of connection like that. And
it relates a bit back to your last question in the sense that he had, felt that we needed to do better job of training Americans to work on matters of international affairs. They co-founded it a few years after 45. And Christian Herter actually does most of the work in setting it up. But it's interesting, I think at least, the original vision was going to be they would appeal to US corporations and ask them to send their sort of best and brightest employees to go to the school for 1 or 2 years. And then they would go out, not necessarily in government, they would go out into the world, and you would represent IBM or General Electric or Exxon, and you would have a better understanding of how to deal with the world, because you would have this kind of training with scholar practitioners, and they quickly figured out that no company wanted to give up their best and brightest for a year or two, and so they had to kind of modulate it a bit to oftentimes subsidized by the GI Bill, kind of returning, first of all, returning veterans to, more kind of more traditional kind of academic experience. And then in the 1950s, I think one thing that's interesting to me, so when Nitze comes back out of the Eisenhower administration and spends a lot of time at SAIS, and Christian Herter becomes, governor of Massachusetts, and then ultimately Secretary of State. But Nitze creates a kind of he brings back some of his policy planning staff, and he creates a sort of institute where that you could write papers for Congress, you can write papers even for the State Department, and he does some classified work for the CIA. But very importantly, his great coup is to recruit Hans Morgenthau from the University of Chicago. I think it was a personal triumph from him. Again, his dad had been a professor at the University of Chicago, read a whole book about sort of a Freudian analysis of all this. But he fundamentally doesn't believe that the kind of so-called realist schools out of government has any sense of what it's actually like. And you can kind of write all you want about theories, but the theories don't really account for the reality. And he has experienced that in government. He's has this ambivalent relationship to academia, but I do think there's at least a kernel of truth there that it's important to have an education where you can get a sense of both what's in the book and what's in the theories, and what it's like actually the messiness quite often of people who have been in the room and having to debate matters of war and peace.
Right. It's interesting, right? Because one could argue that the University of Chicago still has problems with people who get wrapped up in realist theories that are divorced from actual political realities. But the idea that Nitze had this, and I don't know whether we should attribute this to this larger sort of sense of public spirit, right? Is that he feels as though the job then of SAIS is to encourage the development of thinkers who will be able to do the kinds of things that he does, I guess, to move back and forth.
I think
is that fair?
In a broad sense, he wanted to create people who could then go on and tread some of the path that he had created. Incidentally, I don't think he really was somebody who had proteges. I mean, it wasn't like there was individuals that he, particularly was really a close mentor to. He did have some friends, and I make the case in the book that I think Strobe Talbot and Paul Wolfowitz had been his intern at one point, and the Talbot, it was like an interesting relationship, but they kind of learned a lot from him and learned how to do some of the things that he did. But he, I don't think, was somebody who, had a lot of clear mentees.
I mean, it's an interesting question, right? Because because you point out Wolfowitz, you point out that Richard Pearl had worked for him, right? That there are people who would become influential who worked for him. But one of the challenges when you never retire is that you never have a successor. That's something for people to think about. But it is the larger question of, Paul Nitze, a man who was involved in both ideas and actions in American government. He is I don't know, do we still have people like Paul Nitze working in government today? And if we don't, should we be sorry about that?
Well, I think that, we need more people like him, and, not that they have to look like him or, be him. I mean, he was very importantly and helpful to him. He came from comfort, and he, for various reasons, moved on to enough comfort that he didn't have to really work. And I think we need a kind of diversity of background and diversity of thought, without question. I think that, there are, a few people who, not in the high level positions, work issues, particularly nuclear matters, whether it's a Democratic or Republican administration. But one of the things that I would say is that there's more of an emphasis on sort of a team now, in the last 20 or 30 years. You get on one team versus the other. And if you say anything that's kind of heretical to the team, and now whether it's social media, what have you, then you're kind of ostracized. And I think that my advice to people who want to do the types of things that he did, want to have the type of career that he had, is to, focus on the substance. And, I would say that, artificial intelligence is very much like the hydrogen bomb era, that we don't know what the consequences are going to be geopolitically. And, get yourself up to speed and focus on, serious work trying to lay out what the implications are. And keep in mind that anyone can write a mean tweet, anyone can post a meme, but the important thing that can sustain you in your career is to just focus on the substance.
Well, I like that as a final thought for this conversation. Our hour is up, James, but I really think it's important. The book is important. The book is terrific, and the larger message of trying to figure out, how people can serve this country, apply their ideas, and try to make us, I guess, safer. But James Wilson, thanks so much for joining us today on People, Politics, and Prose.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And America's Cold Warrior is available in bookstores now. FPRI thanks its sponsors and partners for their generous support and asks you to consider becoming one of them, because today's conversation is just the beginning. The world goes on, and we will be here to talk about it at FPRI. If you've enjoyed our conversation today, please take a moment and tell a friend, and bring a friend next time when we will gather to analyze our complex world. To keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other events at FPRI, visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, and follow us on X. You can follow the host of this program on X at Ronald Granieri, just as you can follow James Graham Wilson on X. Please consider doing so, and please join us next time. And until next time, for all of us at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.